There's a moment in Vault 11 where something subtle clicks. And it isn't the execution chamber that does it. It's the election records, it's the campaign posters, and it's the way residents argued about strategy instead of morality. That's when you realize this vault wasn't built to test cruelty, it was built to test obedience. Most people summarize Vault 11 in Fallout New Vegas as the vault where they had to sacrifice someone every year. And that's technically accurate, but it leaves out the detail that actually kind of matters. They didn't have to. They only believed they did. And that belief sustained the system for decades. And if you sit with that long enough, the vault stops feeling like exaggerated dystopian fiction and starts feeling disturbingly plausible. Before we go further, if you're new here, this is the Hyperfix Hub. I don't like to recap lore, I like to break down the psychology underneath it, the parts that linger after the game ends. Fallout's world isn't just compelling because of nuclear wastelands and factions. It's compelling because it builds social experiments that mirror real human behavior. Vault 11 is one of the cleanest examples of that design philosophy. And if you enjoy the slower, more analytical approach, this channel exists exactly for that kind of deep dive. Now let's get back into Vault 11. When you first walk inside of Vault 11, it's very tempting to frame it as some sort of horror. But the execution chamber is theatrical. A lone chair faces a projection screen. Holotapes play before a person is killed, and the environment visually echoes something like a saw trap. A moral trap dressed up as a spectacle. But the longer you explore, the less it feels like a spectacle, and the more it feels administrative. There are voting blocks, political alliances, and campaign messaging. Disputes that read like minutes from a city council meeting. Nothing about this feels impulsive. It all feels organized. And honestly, that organization is the true horror. Because the rule is simple. Every year, residents must elect an overseer. The person elected is then executed. If no one is elected, the entire vault population will be terminated. There is no mass villain, there is no dramatic countdown clock, just a system presenting sacrifice as a survival requirement. And when something is presented as procedure, people instinctively treat it as rational. That's the first psychological lever. And if the computer had randomly selected someone each year, the vault would feel arbitrary and cruel. The residents could unite in resentment, the violence would feel imposed from above. But forcing them to vote distributes responsibility. It spreads guilt across the community. Not one single individual feels fully accountable because the vault decided. And once responsibility is shared, it becomes survivable. That's where the architecture of the trap truly begins. The first execution inside Vault 11 was probably unbearable. You can imagine the tension in the atrium, the quiet conversations, the rationalizations, people convincing themselves that it was necessary, that there was no other option. But human beings are remarkably adaptable. When something horrific happens once, it's trauma. When it happens every year under the same procedure, it just becomes predictable. Predictability stabilizes anxiety, and that's when something shifts. The sacrifices stop being framed as murder and starts being framed as policy. Discussions move away from should we be doing this and toward how do we survive the election cycle. Once the brain categorizes something as a routine, it stops reacting to it as a crisis. This isn't unique to fiction. Institutions throughout history have demonstrated how quickly repeated actions become normalized. Even when those actions would have seemed unthinkable initially, the more consistent the structure, the easier it is to accept its outcomes. At this stage in the Vault's timeline, it's worth asking yourself something honestly. If you were inside that sealed environment in year 3 or 4, surrounded by neighbors who believed compliance was protecting everyone, would you risk being wrong? Or would you vote convincing yourself that you were minimizing harm? That question doesn't have a cinematic answer. It doesn't allow you to imagine yourself as a hero without a cost. And that's precisely why it lingers. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment designed to test obedience to authority. Participants believed they were administering increasingly painful shocks to another person. The supposed victim screamed and pleaded and claimed heart issues. Many participants were visibly distressed, and yet a significant percentage continued when calmly instructed to do so by an authority figure in a lab coat. The key detail isn't cruelty, it's transferred responsibility. Participants continued because they believed the authority figure was accountable for their outcome. They saw themselves as an instrument of a larger system. Vault 11's computer functions in the same psychological space. It speaks neutrally. It frames sacrifice as policy. It ties compliance directly to survival. And once survival is attached to obedience, refusing to comply feels completely irresponsible. And that's where the trap is sprung. Obedience doesn't feel submissive, it feels prudent. Over time, that calculation becomes unconscious. Residents don't wake up debating morality. They wake up thinking about alliances, vote counts, and probabilities. The election cycle becomes a logistical challenge rather than a moral one. When morality shifts into navigation, the system gains stability. Now, the Belko experiment presents a similar premise, but in a modern corporate setting. Employees are trapped in an office building and instructed to kill a certain number of coworkers or face collective execution. But unlike Vault 11, the scenario unfolds over hours rather than decades. But the psychological mechanics are strikingly similar. At first, the employees resist. They argue, they refuse to believe that the threat is real. But once the system demonstrates its willingness to enforce consequences, the moral debate fractures. Groups form, justifications emerge. The conversation shifts from we shouldn't do this to if we don't act, everyone else will die. What makes the Belko experiment effective isn't the violence, it's the speed at which ordinary people adapt when survival is framed as conditional. That same mental pivot happens in Vault 11, only stretched across generations and generations. And here's something worth noticing. In both scenarios, the authority doesn't need to constantly intervene. It sets the parameters and allows the participants to regulate themselves. The majority of the enforcement becomes internal. Fear of collective punishment does the rest. That internalization is the real engine of compliance. One of the most powerful forces sustaining Vault 11 isn't fear or cruelty, it's inertia. Once the system has been in place for years, dismantling it requires more than moral disagreement. It requires admitting that prior participation might have been unnecessary. That's a high psychological cost. People are resistant to information that reframes their past actions as avoidable harm. So instead of dismantling the structure, they just try to adjust to it. This phenomenon is often referred to as institutional inertia. Systems persist not because they're efficient or ethical, but because challenging them introduces instability. And instability feels very dangerous. The longer Vault 11 survives without annihilation, the more evidence the residents believe they have that the system works. What we complied and we're still alive becomes proof. Even though annihilation was never going to happen, the absence of catastrophe reinforces their obedience. That feedback loop makes dissent increasingly difficult. If Milgram helps us understand obedience to authority, then Solomon Ash helps us understand obedience to the group. In Ash's experiment, participants were asked to compare simple line lengths, a task so obvious that the correct answer was visually undeniable. Yet when everyone else in the room deliberately chose the wrong answer, many participants conformed. They didn't suddenly lose the ability to see, they lost the willingness to stand alone. And that's distinction matters. Inside Vault 11, the authority is abstract, a computer, a rule, a survival condition. But the group is tangible. It's your neighbors, your family, the people you see every day in the atrium. And once the majority participates in the election cycle without visible resistance, dissent becomes socially costly. Imagine living in a sealed vault where everyone treats the annual sacrifice as necessary. Even if you harbor doubt, you look around and see calm faces, practical conversations, political organizing. No one else appears to be panicking. No one else is staging rebellion. That silence doesn't just imply agreement, it manufactures it. Conformity rarely feels like cowardice from the inside. It feels like cooperation. It feels like maturity, and it feels like not destabilizing a fragile system. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Most people don't need to be forced into compliance if they believe noncompliance will isolate them. Social belonging is a survival instinct. In a closed environment like Vault 11, belonging isn't optional, it's existential. So even if someone privately questions the rule, publicly challenging it risks becoming the person who might doom everyone. And that's a heavy social burden. It's easier to vote and tell yourself that you're minimizing harm than to stand alone and risk being wrong. Over time, dissent doesn't become rare. It becomes over time, dissent doesn't just become rare. It becomes almost unthinkable. There's another real world parallel that deepens this pattern. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. Participants were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment. What began as a controlled study rapidly escalated as participants internalized their assigned roles. Guards became authoritarian, and the prisoners became submissive. The structure of the environment reshaped behavior quicker than anyone anticipated. The experiment had been criticized and debated, but its core insight remains relevant. Environments shape conduct, and roles can override prior moral boundaries. Vault 11 doesn't explicitly assign roles like guard or prisoner, but it does assign political identities: voter, candidate, ally, opposition. Once residents begin forming into factions, those roles gain weight. A person isn't just an individual anymore, they're part of a block. They represent a position, and they defend a strategy. And once identity becomes entangled with structure, questioning the structure feels like undermining your own identity. This is one of the most subtle dangers in institutional systems. People begin to defend the framework not because they believe in it wholeheartedly, but because their sense of self has become intertwined with their participation in it. To dismantle the rule would mean admitting that years of strategy, campaigning, and maneuvering were all built on false premises. That's not just a political shift, it's an existential one. So instead of confronting the possibility that the rule might be hollow, it's easier to double down on navigating it effectively. Competence becomes a substitute for morality. If you can't stop the system, you at least learn how to win within it. And that shift from moral evaluation to performance inside the system is the moment where long term compliance becomes almost guaranteed. Albert Bandura described a concept called moral disengagement, where individuals reframe harmful behavior in a way that allows them to preserve a positive self image. One of the most common mechanisms of moral disengagement is euphemistic labeling, changing the language around an action to soften the impact. In Vault 11, no one says we're executing our neighbor. They just say we're electing an overseer. The violence is wrapped in civic terminology. The ritual is structured, procedural, and orderly. The language shifts the emotional weight. This isn't accidental. Systems that require harm often rely on sanitized vocabulary to make participation easier. Words like collateral damage, necessary measures, or stability obscure the human cost behind the abstraction. Inside the vault, the annual executions stop being described as a tragedy and start being described as part of the process. The linguistic shift allows residents to maintain the belief they're still the moral people operating under difficult circumstances. And here's where the retention pivot naturally emerges. If the language of a system can reshape how harm is perceived, how often do we overlook brutally simple because it's framed in neutral terms? Vault 11 doesn't force that question on you, it lets it surface quietly. As the election cycle continues, year after year, something predictable happens. Power concentrates around those who understand the system best. Political alliances become durable, strategies become refined, and influences accumulates. This is where Catherine Stone's story becomes more than a personal tragedy. It becomes a lens through which we see how systems generate leverage. When her husband becomes a likely candidate, influential figures approach her with the offer to manipulate the vote in exchange for personal concessions. The execution, once framed purely as survival policy, becomes currency. Death is no longer just a necessity, it's a bargaining chip. What makes this development particularly disturbing is that it doesn't represent a break from the system. It represents a logical evolution. When harm is guaranteed somewhere within a structure, the ability to redirect that harm becomes power. And because the structure itself is still believed to be necessary, exploiting it doesn't feel like a rebellion. It feels like strategy. This is where the institutional inertia becomes entangled with self interest. Those who benefit from the system have little incentive to question the premise. Their influence depends on its continuation. Even those who don't benefit directly may hesitate to dismantle it, because doing so would destabilize the only order they've known. Over time, the annual sacrifice stops being about survival alone and it becomes control. Once control enters the equation, dismantling the system threatens not just safety, but status. What's remarkable about Vault 11 is how gradually fear recedes as the primary motivator. In the early years, the threat of annihilation likely dominates conversations, but as decades pass without catastrophe, fear becomes background noise, habit replaces panic. When something occurs on a fixed schedule under a consistent procedure, it stops feeling extraordinary. It becomes a calendar event, a season, or the election cycle. The election cycle likely develops its own rhythms: campaigning, negotiation, and anticipation. A habit is powerful. Once an action becomes habitual, it requires less emotional energy to perform. The annual sacrifice may still be grim, but it's familiar, and familiarity reduces intensity. That reduction in intensity makes moral disengagement vastly easier. When the emotional shock fades, the system feels stable. Stability breeds confidence, and confidence breeds continuity. And here's where we can pause again, but not dramatically, but thoughtfully. The most enduring systems in history rarely sustain themselves through constant error, they sustain themselves through routine. Vault 11 doesn't collapse under brutality, it collapses under arithmetic. One of the most powerful reinforcements of the Vault 11 system doesn't come from authority or factional politics. It comes from time. The longer the vault survives, the more the rule begins to feel validated. For the first generation, the sacrifice is shocking and new. They remember the outside world. They know that other structures once existed. But for children born inside the vault, the annual election is simply part of their reality. It is no longer a moral question, it's part of the infrastructure. When a system is present from birth, it doesn't feel imposed. It feels perfectly natural. This is where belief becomes inheritance. The second generation doesn't experience the rules as something introduced, they experience it as something always present. They grow up hearing adults speak about the election cycle as necessary. They see the vault survive year after year without annihilation. Survival becomes evidence. And that evidence, while logically flawed, feels convincing. This is a classic confirmation bias loop. Each year that passes without catastrophe reinforces the assumption that compliance is working. The vault elects an overseer, executes the chosen individual, and nothing explodes. The absence of disaster becomes the proof of necessity. From inside the system, it appears that obedience does prevent annihilation. What makes it psychologically powerful is that it doesn't require deception from the residents. It only requires a failure to test the premise. As long as no one collectively refuses early enough, the illusion of validation persists. And once the belief has accumulated years of evidence, challenging it feels irrational. If someone in year 20 suggests that the rule might be hollow, they aren't just questioning authority, they're questioning 2 decades of lived experience. They're implying that every prior sacrifice might have been avoidable. That is an accusation heavy enough to fracture the entire community. So the belief has to deepen instead. There's another psychological mechanism reinforcing compliance here: cognitive dissonance. When individuals participate in harmful actions under the belief that those actions are necessary, their minds adjust to protect their self image. If you vote for someone's execution, you must believe that it was required. Otherwise, you would have to confront the possibility that you contributed to unnecessary harm. The more someone participates in a system, the more invested they become in believing the system is justified. This creates a feedback loop. Participation reinforces beliefs, and belief reinforces participation. And doubt becomes psychologically expensive because accepting that the rule might be false would mean accepting that previous actions were avoidable. It is easier to defend the structure than to dismantle the story that allows you to live with yourself. By the time the vault's population dwindles significantly, the residents are no longer just complying out of fear. They are defending a narrative. They believe the rules keep them alive. They believe their sacrifices have meaning. Meaning stabilizes the suffering, and this is where the tragedy of the final reveal becomes clear. As the population shrinks, the political complexity of the vault begins to erode. Factions lose members. Alliances become harder to sustain. The mathematics of manipulation grow thin. With fewer residents, the elections become more intimate and more immediate. There are fewer buffers between voter and victim. This is the stage where the illusion of strategic control fades. Earlier in the Vault's history, someone could believe that clever maneuvering might protect them. With only a handful of people left, maneuvering becomes nearly impossible. The system reveals its starkness. And here's an important shift: the refusal does not emerge during the height of political activity. It emerges when the system is finally exhausted. After decades of adaptation, justification, and maneuvering, there is little left to optimize. Survival has narrowed to its final arithmetic. The last five residents refuse to vote. This decision is not framed as heroism, it is framed as exhaustion. They chose collective death over another execution, not because they suddenly discovered courage, but because the cost of continuing has become unbearable. It's worth sitting with that distinction. The refusal doesn't arise from ideological awakening. It arises from depletion. And that detail matters because it's just that moral clarity often comes only after prolonged endurance rather than immediate resistance. When the computer activates and reveals that the sacrifice was never required, the devastation isn't in the deception alone, it's in the reframing. For decades, residents believed they were preventing annihilation. They believed they were choosing the lesser evil. That belief allowed them to absorb the guilt. The reveal strips that belief away. What remains is not just grief, but dissonance. The narrative that justified their actions collapses instantly. Every election cycle, every factional dispute, and every coerced decision is reinterpreted as absolutely avoidable. The pain of this realization is not theatrical, it's internal. Four of the five survivors take their own life. This act often reads as a dis- This act is often read as despair, but it also reflects the implosion of meaning. As suffering once had a purpose and now that purpose is gone, the weight intensifies. They are left confronting decades of participation without the insulation of necessity. Only one survivor exits the vault, and what he carries is not victory. It is awareness. Survivor's guilt typically involves questioning why one lived when the others did not. In Vault 11, it carries an additional layer. The final survivor doesn't just grieve the dead, he knows the rule was hollow. He understands that the system persisted because no one challenged it soon enough. Awareness isolates. Once you recognize that authority can be sustained by belief rather than necessity, you begin to question other structures. You begin to notice how procedure can conceal harm. That kind of where that kind of awareness is destabilizing, not just for the individual, but for any system that depends on unexamined legitimacy. Vault 11 lingers because it reframes obedience not as a villainy, but as an adaptation. The residents were not uniquely monstrous. They were human, and they sought stability. They trusted the procedure. They normalized routine. And that is precisely what makes this story unsettling. If you step if you step back from Vault 11 and look at the psychological parallels we traced, Milgram's obedience, Ash's conformity, and Zimbardo's role internalization, Bandura's moral disengagement, something becomes clear. None of these experiments required inherent None of these experiments required inherently cruel participants. They just required structure. They required authority, and they required a situation where responsibility felt diffused or transferred. Vault 11 combines all of them. Milgram explains why residents defer to the computer's authority when survival is framed as conditional. Osh explains why dissent fades when the majority appears compliant. Zimbardo explains how political identity and factional roles reshape behavior over time. And institutional inertia explains why the system becomes harder to dismantle the longer it persists. Moral disengagement explains how the language of the election softens the brutality of execution. What makes Vault 11 powerful is that it does not rely on any single mechanism. It layers them. Its obedience isn't forced to gun isn't for its obedience isn't forced at gunpoint. It's cultivated through legitimacy. Conformity isn't enforced through threat alone. It's reinforced through social cohesion. Roles aren't assigned explicitly. They emerge organically through political structure. And once they emerge, they reshape conduct. The vault is not a trap in the theatrical sense. It is an architect. It is the architecture of compliance, and that architecture is disturbingly realistic. Because in the real world, most destructive systems do not sustain themselves through constant overt violence. They sustain themselves through normalization, through shared responsibilities, through language that reframes harm as procedure. Vault 11 isn't terrifying because it's exaggerated. It's terrifying because it is plausible. When you compare Vault 11 to the Belko experiment, the difference isn't in the premise but in the tempo. In the Belko experiment, office employees are instructed to kill a specific number of coworkers or face a collective punishment. The escalation is rapid, panic sets in immediately, alliances form under the pressure. Justifications are constructed within hours. What's striking in Belko is how quickly ordinary people adapt once the threat proves credible. Once the first consequences occur, disbelief collapses. The conversation shifts from resistance to optimization. Who must die? How do we minimize loss? How do we survive? Vault 11 stretches that same psychological pivot across decades instead of hours. In both cases, the authority doesn't need to micromanage its behavior. It establishes the parameters and allows participants to regulate themselves. Most of the violence becomes self administered. Fear of collective punishment is enough. The difference is that Vault 11 demonstrates how sustained compliance can outlive fear. In Belko, panic drives decisions, and Vault 11, habit does. By the later years of the Vault, the sacrifice isn't fueled by adrenaline. It's fueled by routine. That shift from panic to normalization is what makes Vault 11 more unsettling. It suggests that the most durable systems are not those that terrify consistently, but just those that become the background. Institutional inertia is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, it's procedural, it builds weight over time. The longer a system exists, the more difficult it becomes to dismantle. Not because it's perfect, but because it's familiar. Vault 11 demonstrates how history itself becomes reinforcement. Each prior election cycle becomes a precedent. Each year of survival becomes justification. The past accumulates as evidence, even if that evidence is misinterpreted. Challenging the rule late in the Vault's timeline would require residents to confront not just authority, but also their memory. It would require admitting that parents, friends, and community leaders participated in something that was not necessary. That is psychologically destabilizing. So the system continues. Not because it's constantly defended through passion, but because undoing it would unravel way too much. This is the quiet danger of legitimacy. Once a structure is accepted as necessary, it gains momentum, and momentum can carry a system far beyond the point of necessity. Vault 11 collapses only when there is almost nothing left to sustain. Caesar's Legion represents obedience in a different aesthetic. It is overt, ideological, and hierarchical. It frames compliance as strength and dissent as a weakness. Where Vault 11 hides behind ballots and civic language, the Legion hide behind philosophy and discipline. But psychologically, they share the same foundations. Both tie stability to obedience. Both present order as protection against chaos, and both normalize harm as is necessary for survival. The difference lies in the presentation, not the mechanism. The Legion uses ideology to reshape identity. Vault 11 uses procedure to reshape behavior. In one case, obedience is loud and militarized. In the other, it is quiet and administrative. And that's what makes Vault 11 so important in the broader pattern Fallout explores. It demonstrates that obedience does not require charismatic leadership. It does not require banners or speeches. It only requires belief and legitimacy. If people believe the system protects them, they will defend it. If they believe dissent risks catastrophe, they will silence it. If they believe harm is preventative rather than malicious, they will rationalize it. That pattern appears in the Legion, in Vault 11, and in countless real world structures across history. The vulnerability is not cruelty, it is trust. Vault 11 lingers because it reframes the horror. The execution chamber is not the core of the story. The ballots are. The residents were not uniquely monstrous. They were adaptive and they sought stability. They trusted the procedure and they deferred responsibility. They normalized the routine, and that is a very human thing to do. It is easy to imagine yourself as the one who would have refused in year one, but it is way harder to imagine yourself in year 15 surrounded by neighbors who believe compliance has kept you alive, weighing the risk of being wrong. It is harder to still imagine dismantling a system that has defined your entire life. Vault 11 suggests that destructive systems often persist not because people enjoy them, but because they adapt to them. The longer the system survives, the harder it becomes to challenge, the more participation it accumulates, the more difficult it becomes to admit that participation may be unnecessary. The final survivor walking into the Mojave does not carry triumph, he carries awareness. He has seen how obedience can outlive necessity, and how procedure can mask harm, and how belief can sustain a hollow structure for decades. That awareness is isolating, but it's the only thing that breaks the cycle. If there is a lesson buried inside Vault 11, it is not that authority is always malicious. It is that authority becomes dangerous when it goes unquestioned. It is not that people are evil. It is that people are adaptable, and adaptation without examination can sustain harm longer than fear ever could. Fallout returns to this theme repeatedly, whether through the Legion's ideological rigidity or the quiet compliance of Vault 11. Stability is comforting, structure feels safe, but when safety is tied to unquestioned obedience, harm can persist long after it was necessary. Authority does not need to be loud to be dangerous. It only needs to feel legitimate. And that is a harder truth to dismiss. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Hyperfix Hub and let me know. If you were in Vault 11, would you question the authority or do you think that you would go along with the group?